Okay, so our first speaker today is Samir Salim. He's a faculty at Indiana University, and he received his PhD from the Ohio State University in 2002. And then he moved to UCLA to work as a postdoc on the Galaxies data, and then at Noir Lab. And today he's going to talk about physical drivers of emission lines in SDSS, Seyferts, and liners. So if you can share your screen and go ahead. Thank you.
Thank you, Syria, and thank you everybody for joining. I know there have been a lot of Zoom talks recently, so I really appreciate you coming to this one as well. Okay, so today I'm going to be talking about old survey SDSS, but some new stuff going on with it, some new sort of analysis that we able to do with that. So first, I'm going to sort of focus this talk on AGN, although it's a little bit more general than that. And we all know that AGN are believed to be potentially very important in galaxy evolution, in particular with the process of quenching of galaxies, of the quenching of star formation in galaxies. Now, what exact role AGN play in that, especially for massive galaxies, is not still quite well known. We have a lot of models. All of these models require testing. And for that, we actually first need to have a good census of AGN. And that alone has been a topic that a lot of people have been pursuing, trying to understand how best to select AGN and how to get rid of potential contamination there and so on. And the second thing is, once we have the AGN census, we also want to be able to characterize it in a way that will be robust. So today I'll actually be focusing on this second aspect. And I should also mention that we believe that this quenching is still ongoing at low redshift. So it is still important to be looking at clues as to the connection between AGN and galaxy evolution, even in the local universe, which is what my talk will be focusing on. So first, just a few reminders. AGN, we typically divide them in two types based on their observational characteristics. So type 1 are the, if you just think about the AGN in general, you know, the first thing that may come to your mind if you're not like into galaxy evolution is like quasars, Seyfert ones, things where we actually see the central engine directly without obscuration. And that results in also having a broad lines and typically a bluish continuum. Now, because of these effects and how this light affects the galaxy, they are actually not the best examples to study in the context of galaxy evolution. So we actually try to remove them in most of our samples. And that's relatively easy because their characteristics are such that it's easy to identify them very robustly that these must be type 1 AGN. However, there aren't that many of them, so we don't necessarily lose much in terms of our sample sizes. So I'll be focusing on what are known as type 2 AGN, which typically include Seyfert 2s, as opposed to Seyfert 1s, which are type 1 AGN, and maybe, or to some extent, galaxies known as liners. Now, these two categories may actually account for almost as much as 1/2 of all the massive galaxies. And the difference is that now we no longer see the central engine directly. It's because it's probably obscured by dust. So what we actually end up seeing are mostly just narrow lines, including emission from Balmer lines and also from forbidden lines. Okay. And unlike for type 1 AGN, we no longer have the problem that the continuum is being affected by the bluish light. So the continuum should be intact, which allows us to study the characteristics of these galaxies in terms of like the star formations and stellar masses and other things that we can obtain from the studying of the continuum. Now, as I mentioned, liners that belong broadly in this category have been debated in terms of whether they are powered by AGN, by the accretion onto a supermassive black hole, or something else. So I'll sort of come back to that later. Now, a lot of the studies of type 2 AGN are done using emission lines because they are actually very efficient at finding AGN, okay? And if you have spectroscopy, that's relatively easy method to find them. So the idea is that typically we construct what is known as this BPT diagram that combines two line ratios. And we're looking at this diagram, which you can see has these two branches, okay? So if the galaxies is dominated by H2 regions, just star formation, the galaxies would actually form this left branch, the star forming branch. However, is there something extra driving ionization that will give rise to this right branch, which is typically labeled AGN branch, okay? And because the mass is actually increasing down the star forming branch, it is this typically the more massive galaxies that normally we think of containing the AGN in them. So what is how does this morphology of this diagram arise? Okay, so that's actually the central question of my talk. Now, for the star forming branch, the answer is well understood. You can run photoionization models, and you'll get grids like these that show you that you can explain different positions on the star forming branch by assuming different gas phase metallicities and also different levels of ionization. And that sort of agrees with this idea that as you go down the branch, you get into higher mass galaxies with also higher metallicities. Okay, but the question is about this so-called AGN branch. Now, first of all, if you look a little bit more closely, you'll see that it's not necessarily just a uniform structure. There seems to be something like two sub-branches in it, such that the one that it shoots more upward is what is known as the Seyfert 2 branch, but I'll just call it Seyfert branch. And then we have the liner branch or sub-branch that is somewhere here, okay? But its actual position is not well seen here because there's a lot of overlap actually between these two populations, at least when we look at them using these particular line ratios, which are the ones that are most often used. Now, the idea is that hopefully we can actually use these line ratios of galaxies on the Seyfert liner branch to learn something about the AGN, intrinsically about the AGN. Things such as their accretion rates, their intrinsic luminosity, their power, essentially, and also the characteristics of the central ionization, such as the hardness of the ionization. So what's the shape of the ionizing spectrum, right? Other properties of the ISM involved with the AGN, such as the electron densities, also the metallicity, as I mentioned, as one of the parameters, and things like ionization parameter. So knowing the diversity of these parameters for AGN, and that could be a very important clue in understanding whether they can actually drive things such as quenching, because that will depend on power and things like that. However, there is a big problem with using the observed line ratios to infer anything about the AGN or liners, okay? The problem is that most of these objects actually have a lot of star formation going on in them. So if you look at this plot of log SSFR, the specific star formation rate versus mass, so this is for all the galaxies in the local universe, and this is only those on the Seyfert liner branch, you see that most of them actually have quite substantial star formation, such that they are, to a large extent, on the main sequence or just below that. That means that in a typical spectrum that we have from SDSS, that is a 3 arcsecond fiber that covers something like a 1.5 kiloparsec in radius as a typical redshift, you're going to get a lot of contribution from H2 regions. Now, you may think, okay, what about those IFU studies like MANGA that have brought about so much new information about resolved properties of galaxies, including their emission lines? Well, we still have that problem because the resolution of MANGA is actually something like 2.5 arcseconds. So it still allows for a lot of star formation contamination, even in its central spaxel. Okay. Furthermore, there can also be other contributions, such as diffuse ionized gas. that may also kind of obfuscate the pure emission lines that we really hope to get from Seyferts and liners. So this study is actually about trying to solve this problem. Okay. Now, because this problem hasn't been yet solved, what are the current ideas regarding how important this contamination by star formation is? And the leading idea that has been around for the last 20 years is that this contamination is actually very important, in the sense that the fact that we have a AGN branch as some extent, continuous extent, rising from the lower part of the star forming branch and going shooting up, that it's primarily the result of the different amounts of mixing between what would be true AGN lines, or specifically for Seyferts, and then adding more and more star formation. So essentially the idea is that Seyferts intrinsically should lie on top of this branch, but because they have been mixed with different amounts of star formation by different amounts, they actually end up connecting with the star forming branch for those ones that have the highest fraction of contamination. So that has been what is known as the mix and sequence scenario, which I said is the dominant idea in the literature. And the other possibility is that mixing, while it certainly must be there, nobody's saying that it's not there, that it's actually secondary, that it doesn't actually produce such a huge effect, that intrinsically we still have a big range of parameters, but the additional star formation may be shifting things slightly, okay, and introducing noise, essentially, to whatever we observe. But that fundamentally, there is a big range of intrinsic properties for Seyferts and maybe also liners. So just again, demonstrating the mixing sequence from some of the papers, the idea is that you have potentially maybe pure liner and also a pure Seyfert on the top here. And then by adding in the models different levels of star formation, you end up eventually getting down to the star forming branch. And the idea especially would be that this region here, that is below the so-called maximum starburst line, would be galaxies, Seyferts and liners that would have a high star forming contamination. And sometimes some studies exclude those galaxies because, like I said, we cannot really learn much about them because they have so much contamination from star formation. But what about the intrinsic scenario? Is it even feasible? Well, most models say that it should be. So models are able to actually populate this full parameter space. But the question is, does that happen in reality? And so far, we didn't have a good answer to that. Now, the study that my graduate student, Chris Agostino, has been leading, he has been working on this for the last 2 years. It took us a long time to actually try to hone the strategy and to really understand what is going on here. It's actually, the fundamental idea is very, very simple. The idea is that because SDSS has so many galaxies, we should hope to be able to find for each galaxy on the Seyfert liner branch, the AGN branch, you should be able to find its doppelganger, its match among galaxies that are not on that branch. And the idea is that subtracting the emission line fluxes of those galaxies that we match should be able to actually empirically tell us how much of the contribution in the lines is actually due to things such as star formation, or maybe some other things like, as I said, diffuse ionized gas, leaving only the intrinsic emission from the AGN or the liner. So when we do this matching, we do not only match to galaxies that are on the star forming sequence here, but also to galaxies that may have oxygen 3 or H beta that is too weak to place them on this diagram, but for which we still know, based on the N2 to H alpha, that there must not contain an AGN in them. So that's also allowed in the matching pool. as well also as galaxies that actually don't have any detectable emission lines. Okay, just in case they have a little bit, such as, again, as I said, from some diffuse gas or something like that, we still want to have a match for those galaxies as well. So again, here shown is the SSFRs and the masses of the galaxies on the AGN branch, and these are the potential matches, which you can see span the same parameter space, at least in these two coordinates. Now, because we want to get as close a match as possible, we match not just by star formation rate and the mass, the stellar mass, we also match by the mass that is contained in the SDSS fiber, which also gives us the idea of the central concentration, which recent studies have shown like sigma 1 to be an important parameter. Plus, we also match by the amount of dust and also by the redshift, so that we actually can do this in fluxes, not in luminosity, which is much more complicated. Anyway, what we find is that we can find always a good match for any galaxy on the AGN branch. We can always find a good match among the ones that are not on the AGN branch. So when we do that, we subtract these lines, and what we end up with is what we hope to be the clean spectra of Seyferts and liners. By the way, just to mention that we are getting these estimates of star formation rates and the mass and the dust from the catalog that I had developed earlier, which is based on the SED fitting. So this is the GSWLC catalog that combines Galaxies, SDSS, WISE in the infrared, and does this sophisticated SED fitting to get properties of galaxies such as the mass and star formation rate and so on. Obviously, we cannot match by the nebular star formation rate because that will be contaminated by the AGN, right? So we have to use some other star formation rate to be able to do this matching. And here are the results. Okay, so on the right plot, this was the original AGN branch, Seyfert liners. And then when we do this subtraction of star formation. Okay, so it may look like nothing much has happened, really. And that was our first thing that we realized, like, wait a minute, nothing much has happened, really. Things have not drastically changed. Specifically, it's not a case that now these pure lines are now all in the top of the AGN branch or the Seyfert sub-branch, which would be around here originally, and liner sub-branch around here. No, we still have all these galaxies populating the full extent of the original branch. Actually, if you look at the shifts between the observed lines and these decontaminated lines and show them as these little vectors, you can see that, yeah, there are shifts, but are not drastic. And overall, they do not change the morphology of this AGN branch so much. So from that, we conclude that mixing cannot be the dominant factor of what is going on here. For example, if you look specifically in Seyferts, yes, there is, after we do the removal, the whole Seyfert branch does actually shift slightly, okay? But again, it's not to the point that we remove intrinsic diversity there. Now, how about actually trying to separate Seyferts and liners? Those of you who have done this sort of things know that we need to use additional emission lines to be able to do this more cleanly, such as sulfur 2 or oxygen 1, okay? And that has been shown before. Now, we also want to do that. We want to separate Seyferts and liners as best as we can, but we actually want to use all of the lines that we had at our disposal, not these plots like this. So what we do is the k-means algorithm, in which we actually look at the similarity and the relative similarity of different lines and do that on everything on the AGN branch. And we end up with actually 3 categories. One is obviously identifiable with Seyferts, but we also get that what would normally be considered liners actually seem to divide into 2 categories. And we call them soft and hard liners, and you'll see in a moment why that is the case. So comparing this decomposed AGN branch in now these 3 categories with the one that where these galaxies were in the original BPT before the star formation removal, you'll see that roughly it's the same positions, but there's less of an overlap now. Okay, for example, like Seyfert, soft and hard liners seem better separated, and also Seyfert 2s and the soft liners also seem to be slightly better separated. And that's because we are using these decontaminated lines to do that. Okay, now that we have separated these into what we think are maybe the three basic types of objects on the AGN branch, let's study their physical properties. Okay, so here I'll be showing a bunch of color-coded plots that are color-coded by different physical properties. Like in this one, we have the ionization parameter, and you can see that actually there is a trend, especially in the vertical direction here. This other one shows the metallicity, and there also seems to be a trend, but now mostly in the horizontal direction. So actually that agrees to a large extent to what the models were predicting, if there was an intrinsic diversity, which we now show that there is. Now, the big difference when you look at the O1 to S2 ratio, which is the indication of the hardness of the SED, is between the soft liners and these hard liners. You see there seem to be a very different sort of objects, okay? And also, okay, I'll skip the electron density. We know it's the highest in Seyferts. So points that I want to make is this new class of liners actually would not be identifiable using the classic diagrams that use sulfur, for example, because they would actually overlap. Even when we take out the star formation contribution, they would actually overlap with the pure star forming galaxies. So this just tells us that nitrogen 2 is actually critical for identifying the liners in general. Now, could liners be AGN, as some people think? We think that it's actually quite plausible that it is the case. One reason for that is that we always find a good match for a liner among the non-liners. Whereas if this was a purely a stellar population phenomenon, you would expect that it would always be on, because if you have star population, they should be doing that liner thing. But we don't find that that's the case. We find that it's either on or off. So that may indicate that at least some of these could be actually AGN. And one can maybe speculate even about some evolutionary sequence in the way that in some initial phase, AGN start as soft liners, and then they sort of shoot up along what is known as the Seyfert branch, and then they become more quiescent later on. As you can see, these hard liners tend to be, a lot of them tend to also be quiescent, that you actually go down in this way. Again, we're just very preliminary, and we don't know if that's the case yet. So anyway, just to conclude, we did the first empirical statistical decomposition with the aim of trying to understand the diversity of emission lines on the BPT diagram, and you find it's actually primarily intrinsic, not that it's the mixing with star formation that is driving this. There is a connection with the physical parameters as expected from the models, and now we show that this range is actually very wide, that there are AGN of many different characteristics. And whether liners actually belong to that is something that still remains to be seen. Okay, thank you for your attention.
Thank you for your talk. This was extremely interesting. Such a nice, simple idea, and so powerful in terms of the results. Okay, so do we have questions? So I'll start with one question, which is that every time we come up with new classification into different categories, the question is, how much of that is, how much evidence do you have for the fact that these liners are really two distinct families? You even put them at the different opposite ends of the evolutionary sequence, or rather than just there being a continuum of hardness in between these two categories.
Yes, so I agree that for now we have only a tentative thing, and we don't see any clear bimodality necessarily in properties. However, one thing that strikes us as potentially being meaningful in that sense is that if we were just to combine, I don't have a plot like that, where we would combine actually these soft and hard liners, you see that that would be a combination of the lower two plots. They would have this kink, such that you see that these are mostly kind of going this way, and then these are mostly going, this horizontal way. So their distribution seems somewhat unnatural, and that's maybe again a hand waving thing. This is based only on the algorithm, right? So there's a more similarity in this group among themselves than in this group, and it is a lot of that is driven by actually low O1 to H alpha, and this has been hypothesized, like even back in the 90s by Louis Scott, that there may be another group there, but it hasn't been really pursued much. So yes, I agree. I mean, it could still be tentative, and the evolutionary sequence certainly is. We'll see about that. It's very, very early now to say about that.
Okay, thanks. Martin?
Yes, hi, I'm sorry. Very interesting stuff. I thought it was great. But I missed the bit where you said why it was hard and why it was soft. Was that something to do?
Yeah, that was based on the O1 to S2 ratio, which is an indication of that. And you see that they're actually lying on opposite ends of this range. Actually, the Seyfert 2s are sort of in between that sense. So it's measured by the line ratio, which is not a perfect method by all, but that's what we have.
It's an evolutionary thing. The ionizing continuum is changing, or is it just adding a standard SED for an AGN to a starburst?
Well, there's no starburst here. This is all without starburst.
So the SED is changing and becoming harder as
it's changing. It's getting harder now. Why is that the case? Who knows? Maybe it's also because the dust obscuration can also change the hardness as well. But we haven't looked into that. But it could be intrinsic. That's the idea. Yes.
That would be fun.
Becky?
Thank you.
Okay, apologies. My internet is pretty bad today for some reason. My question is about liars, which are off nuclear liners for people that don't know. And I was wondering, I mean, they're found in manga because of course it's resolved spatially. But I was wondering how those fit into this picture. Are they hard or soft, or what do you think about that?
Yes. So most of those are actually these hard liners, just in the way that have been selected, because their selection in manga is based on a plot like this, and they do require that liner should be above this line here. Now we show that actually, if you select by nitrogen 2 by just the typical BPT diagram, you'll have them on both sides actually. But these are considered to be, have mostly been considered to be just the result of a lot of star formation contamination have been removed from most of the samples. Whereas this one, the Harlan is more like the traditional one. So the one that has been studied by manga. So it is true that those are actually the category for which we are at least certain about whether they may be AGN or not. And again, I'm also not saying that we know that these are AGN. So these liars that actually have extended emission like that could be among here. But what we add to this is that we have nevertheless cleaned them of star formation contribution, which we do know does plague liners and Seyferts alike. And this sample, of course, is just general Sloan, and we could also focus only on manga, which is much smaller sample, of course. But we could maybe then see if we can make some further distinctions between the ones that have more extended liner emission and the ones that are more centrally concentrated.
That would be really cool. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, let's thank again Samir for a really interesting talk and discussion. And we should move on to our second speaker. Tatiana, you want to introduce?
Yes. Hi, everybody. So I'm happy to introduce you now to our second speaker. Remember, if you have questions, you can just raise your hand. And we are recording our session today. So our next speaker is Lauren Lenz. She holds a bachelor degree in physics and astronomy from the University of Maryland, College Park, and a PhD in astronomy and astrophysics from Harvard University. She worked with Christine Jones and Bill Foreman on radio galaxies and completed her thesis with Howard Smith and Matt Ashby, focusing on galaxy mergers. Her postdoctoral research at IPAC with Patrick Ogle focused on star formations activity in radio galaxies. In her second postdoc at Dartmouth College, working with Ryan Hitchcock, she focused on AGN activity in post-starburst and swift-bat galaxies. As of fall 2019, she's assistant professor at the College of New Jersey. So I'm very happy to introduce you, Lorraine. So please, can you share your screen and can you start your talk? Thank you very much for being here with us today.
Well, thank you for having me. So it's my pleasure today to tell you a bit about the work that I've been doing the last couple of years, primarily with these collaborators. In the last year and a half or so, I've also been joined by a number of different students at the College of New Jersey. So the College of New Jersey is an undergraduate only institution. We have about 6,000 students and we're outside of Trenton. And some of the work that I'll be talking about today has had major contributions by Alex Nazaroff and Sofia Stepanov. I will very briefly gloss over what Nick Toussey did with me and then presented at AAS. And at the end, I will hopefully have time to briefly touch on work that Simran Kaur and Anthony Ortega are doing with me right now. So Samir really set me up nicely discussing the general idea of how galaxies evolve from actively star forming to quiescent, and understanding that transition is really one of the major open questions in galaxy evolution. And my specific interest is, well, what role do AGN play in this transition to quiescence? Now, I've taken a somewhat different approach. Instead of looking at all galaxies and trying to see where you find AGN, the way I approach this is, well, let's pick the interesting galaxies. Let's go for post-starbursts because of their post-starbursts.
Sorry to interrupt you. There's a window that is showing up with build order. It's a PowerPoint window that is on top of your presentation, and I'm afraid we're going to lose important information.
Okay, give me one sec.
Yeah.
How about now?
Great,
Good.
Thank you.
Excellent. Thanks for letting me know, because it was not showing up on my end. Okay, so we're interested in post-starburst galaxies because those galaxies show evidence of recent star formation, but not ongoing star formation. So they recently left the state. They haven't fully entered this state. They're prime for trying to understand how this transition is going on. And so we want to understand what is happening with the supermassive black holes. So this is a big question. So I've broken it down into smaller questions. First of all, are there AGN during the post-starburst phase? And if they are, how active are they? And when are they active? Relatedly, does the activity of these AGN matter? So if we put these two pieces together, essentially what we're asking is, are AGN active early, late, during the entire thing? And are they actually helping to drive the transition, or are they just along for the ride? Whatever is driving the transition, whether it's a merger or some less violent process, is that just driving, funneling some gas to the center and turning the AGN on, but its activity doesn't intrinsically help drive the transition? The answer to this third question will almost certainly be, it depends. So from there, you would go then to, under what conditions are there AGN whose activity matters? Now, this would be a lot to get through in 20 minutes. And quite honestly, I don't actually have the answers to most of these later questions. So all I'm really going to touch on today is, are there AGN during this phase, and how active are they? Okay, so I'm not the first person by any means to ask this question, but we haven't really reached much consensus on this point. Michael Brown in 2009 looked at about 24 K+A galaxies and concluded, yes, they're common. About half of them show X-ray signatures of AGN. Great. But then more recently, we looked at E+A galaxies with WISE colors. Yes, they're a little bit enhanced compared to ellipticals and spirals, but they in no way meet the much higher bar for where we would expect AGN to be. This is similar to what Helmut Musinger and collaborators found looking at post-starbursts in SDSS and finding that most of them don't have optical AGN signatures. Now, how all of this plays with complications with star formation, I'm sure we can ask Samir to speak to that if we want. But there was this whole question of, some say common, some say rare. what do we think is the actual answer? So we have approached this question in two parallel tracks, looking at some nearby post-starburst galaxies that have a greater wealth of observations, but also using samples of post-starbursts to get a more general sense of what's going on in the population. So let me start with the nearby post-starbursts. In particular, I'm going to briefly tell you about NGC 1266, which kind of started us on this road, NGC 1377, and IC 860. In terms of distance, 1377 is closest at 21 megaparsecs, 1266 is next at 29, and IC 860 is most distant at 59 megaparsecs. But 1377 is also distinctly less massive than the other two. If we look in the mid-infrared, these are Spitzer 3-color images. We see that the 8 micron, shown in red, is centrally concentrated, which is what we might expect if we have a nice strong AGN that is heating a whole bunch of dust right in the center. In the radio, we also find that they have nuclear emission. These are all JVLA observations. IC 860 is relatively dominated by core. The 1266 clearly shows some extended emission, but on quite small scales, we're only looking at a couple arc seconds across here. 1377 is less convincing about extended emission, but definitely has some hints that perhaps there might be a little bit here. This works nicely with the fact that some millimeter observations really do tend to find that the molecular gas is concentrated in the center and shows signature of outflows. So these somewhat difficult blue contours to see right here turn out to be CO integrated contours from Karma, showing that the molecular gas is really centrally concentrated. And we see a similar thing in 1266, where the bulk of this gas is right down in the very center. For the 1266 observation, we broke it down based on the velocity of this gas. In yellow, you have gas that's at the systemic velocity of the galaxy. In red contours is the location of gas that is redshifted with respect to the systemic velocity, and in blue, gas that is blue shifted relative to systemic velocity. The fact that we see an offset between blue shifted and red shifted gas, that's a signature of a bipolar outflow. And from the energetics of these outflows, we really do need them to be AGN driven. There's just not enough star formation to explain the amount of mass being pushed out at those speeds. What about in the X-rays to complete our tour of the wavelength regime? Well, here are the two Chandra observations available for IC 860 and 1377. This was 20 kiloseconds, this was 44 kiloseconds, in which we got a glorious 5 photons and 8 photons. Definitely detected over the background level, but not really enough to do very much with. We tried going after these galaxies with New Star, figuring maybe these are buried AGN, maybe the harder energies of New Star will help us out, but neither of them turned out to be detected in New Star. 1266 is a little bit of a different story. We also have a much longer observation of 150 kiloseconds. I definitely do not have time to talk about the extended structure of this hot gas, which it turns out is nicely coincident with the radio emission, which is what the contours are. This was work that Nick Toussey did. But we can use this set of photons together with a weak detection in New Star to actually constrain the parameters of 1266. It turns out to be relatively low luminosity with an intrinsic 2 to 10 keV luminosity of 7 times 10 to the 40 ergs per second. And that's behind significant amounts of obscuration. So putting this all together, it seems to say, okay, all 3 of these have some indication that the AGN are active, and that they may be, at least to some degree, important in kinematic feedback. At least for 1266, it looks like the gas on the outer parts of this disk of gas in the very center of 1266 may have had its star formation at least somewhat suppressed by the turbulence injected by this outflow. But these AGN look like they might be relatively deeply buried and not that luminous. But it's easy for three objects to be peculiar in their own ways, and that's not necessarily going to tell you a whole lot about the population as a whole. And so to get a better idea of what this might look like more generally, we started looking at samples of post-starbursts. And in particular, I've been focusing mostly on a set of post-starbursts called the Shocked Post-Starburst Galaxy Survey, or SPOGs, which are selected slightly differently from the classical E+A selection. So SPOGs, like E+As, require the presence of A stars. But E+As generally throw out anything that have star formation indicators like H alpha. And thanks to Samir for introducing BPT diagrams. Essentially what we do is use BPT diagrams to select galaxies that have line ratios that are consistent with shock or AGN emission, and could plausibly fall into the star formation regime in no more than 2 of those diagrams, so that they're not completely consistent with having line ratios consistent with star formation. So they're more likely to have recent but not ongoing star formation. This gives us a population of post-starbursts that are on average younger than the classical E+A categories, because we allow potentially other energizing mechanisms, shocks, AGNs, and so on, that the classical characteristic would tend to throw out. We had looked at a set of SPOGs with Karma and IRAM to get a measure of their molecular content. So this is not those galaxies, but we had compared the CO flux density to the 22 micron flux, because for star forming galaxies like the ones from these 3 samples, there's a correlation between these 2 fluxes. And this makes sense. Gas and star formation rate correlate. This is effectively just a restatement of the Kennicutt-Schmidt relation of roughly constant star formation efficiency. In contrast, AGN, such as the set from Aaron Evans, show an excess of infrared flux. Again, this makes sense. With an AGN, you're not changing much the amount of molecular gas in a galaxy. You're just adding another source of infrared emission. So where do SPOGs fall on this? It turns out they all seem to show an excess of infrared, but not as strong as some of these radio AGN, suggesting these guys might have AGN. So we took 12 of these galaxies and very, very kindly asked Chandra, and Chandra said, yes, we will give you 10 kiloseconds apiece. And so I was very excited when I got these 12 images, especially since 9 of them showed detections of X-rays from the nuclear region that were significant. So these are 2 arcsecond circles centered right on the center of the galaxy. It's just one tiny little problem. Yes, there's significant detections, but when your background level tells you that you should expect on average between 1/4 and 1/3 of background photons, you only need about 3 for a significant detection, and at most I had 10. Which is great if all you care about is there AGN or is there X-rays, but even with 10, can't really build a spectrum that you can model reliably to get luminosities or obscuration. And so it's tough to tell the difference between, are these faint because they're heavily buried? Are these faint because they're low luminosity? Are they even AGN, or could it be some sort of hot gas emission? And this is not at all helped by the complication that 1266 has all 3 of these happening at once. Now, the common approach to this is, let's stack them all together, get a sense of the average spectrum. But when you might have a variety of processes going on, I was definitely concerned that that might end up being kind of like, well, let's understand oranges by making fruit salad, which will tell you something since an orange is a fruit, but won't really give you very reliable information. So instead, we decided to approach this from a forward modeling approach. So Alex Nazaroff put the initial steps in place, but most of this work was really done by Sofia Stepanoff. So what we've created is a code that takes in a range of local obscuration. So effectively the amount of gas and dust that you have to get through to see the AGN. intrinsic 2 to 10 keV luminosities. Then for those models, even though we want to compare them on intrinsic luminosity aspects, we actually have to do the modeling in flux space. So we need the distance and the foreground Milky Way obscuration, which goes into the models that we'll create, which is just a very simple model of absorption by the local foreground, obscuration at the scale of the galaxy, and then just assuming a power law, which is pretty common for X-ray models of AGN. Then to actually do our modeling, we need to know how long did Chandra actually look at each of the galaxies, because they're not all exactly 10 kiloseconds. What was the background subtracted number of counts that were actually observed by Chandra? And then we also determine a hardness ratio range. So hardness ratio is effectively a measure of spectral shape. How many of your photons are at low energies in soft X-rays versus high energies in hard X-rays. And we determine this range using the Bayesian BEHR code, which works even if you don't have a great number of counts. So how do we actually do this? Well, for each of 546 different models, so that's each of the little squares in this image, giving you an idea of how we're subdividing our range of luminosities and our range of obscurations. So in each of those squares, we generate 1,000 different mock spectra to take into account the fact that in a given observation, you might have 300 or 330 or 2 or 3 counts. Then we take the distribution in each pixel and ask, how likely is it that that distribution of the number of counts that we would get for that particular luminosity and obscuration combination would have generated the number of observed counts for that particular galaxy? So if we observed 3, how likely is that distribution to have yielded 3, plus or minus the error on the uncertainty, the error on the observation number of counts? Then we take into account the information that we have on hardness ratio. So we know from the BHR that our hardness ratio is likely to be within a particular range. And so for each set of 1,000 spectra, we ask what percentage of them would fall within that range. We then put both of these constraints together to effectively ask which set of models best match both the normalization aspect and the spectral shape aspect. And that gives us a constraint on the properties of that particular galaxy. Sophia then applied this code to all 12 of those, plus IC860 and NGC 1377. And what we find is that these galaxies tend to prefer luminosities between 10 to the 40 and 10 to the 42. So not especially luminous, but on the other hand, not all at like 10 to the 39, where it would be practically absent. Most of them seem to prefer some obscuration, but more on the moderate side. 157 is definitely an outlier in that respect. It definitely had harder emission than most of its the others in the sample. Now for ICN 860 and 1377, we also had new star data. So we applied the same idea to the new star data. And we found that we're actually getting somewhat different answers. So IC 860, power law worked well for both Chandra and new star, but the Chandra data said lower luminosity, lower obscuration. New star said somewhat higher luminosity, definitely higher obscuration. 1377 was interesting because a power law did not work for the Chandra data. It was just too soft. So we also tried a thermal APAC model, and that worked reasonably well, but put it at quite low luminosity. New star, on the other hand, said, yeah, for quite an obscured AGN, I can give you some models that work reasonably well. So we're getting different answers between those two. And we're somewhat still in the process of figuring out exactly what this means. One thing that could be happening here is when you get to such extreme obscurations, our simple model may not work all that well anymore. The other possibility is that Chandra may not be always catching transmitted X-rays. It may be that while NuSTAR is catching the transmitted X-rays, what we're catching here is scattered emission that came to us through lines of sight with lower obscuration, or is just a thermal component like we saw with 1266, where it's just hot gas in the vicinity that may or may not have been excited by the AGN. So two other ways that we're looking to figure out how reliable all of this is work that is currently ongoing. So Simran Kaur is looking at this from a different approach. She's been measuring UV to mid-infrared SEDs of these 14 galaxies and is currently starting to fit these SEDs using models of Chris Carroll, which I'm showing here, which put together different components to give you an idea of the infrared AGN luminosity for these galaxies. And so that'll give us another measure of the activity of the AGN that we can compare to what we're getting from the X-rays. Anthony Ortega is doing this in a slightly different way. He has extended the code to now work with Swift XRT data and is applying it to Swift BAT type 2 AGN. So I had looked at them for a completely different project in 2019. From Mislav Belukovic, we have the luminosities and the true obscurations that come from a combination of modeling XRT plus NuSTAR. And so we're currently in the process of running this methodology just on the XRT to see how well it does at recovering those parameters. And hopefully this summer, we're going to extend it to doing a combination of constraints on XRT plus NuSTAR to see how well that does at recovering those parameters. And as a result, how much we can trust what we get from SPODs. So essentially, what I can tell you is there do seem to be AGN in post-starburst. They look like they may be relatively common in post-starbursts, but it looks like they might be on the lower luminosity end, possibly deeply buried and definitely complicated. So definitely stay tuned to see what we learn from all of this. Thank you, and I'm happy to take questions.
Thank you very much. Great talk.
Yes, thank you so much. So you can use your reaction mode, so you can clap, and thank you so much, Laureen. So if there is any, do you have any questions? Please also, can you raise your hand? William Foreman, could you please make your question? Can you mute yourself?
Hi, Lorraine. Really great talk. Thank you very much. Christine's here as well. I had a question about the set of galaxies you picked for the survey part. Are you able to know anything about their environment, whether they're in groups, whether they're isolated?
I don't remember offhand whether we've done that. It wasn't a selection aspect, but my recollection was that it was a mix, but that most of them were more on the isolated side.
So you had mostly detected, but a couple that you didn't. And so one of the questions might be interesting just to look and see whether there was any environmental effects at all.
Sure, and definitely once I have a better handle on the properties of the AGN, what I want to look at is are there any trends with the galaxies that they live in, both environments, but also how long has it been since they stopped star forming? Where do they fall in the post-starburst evolutionary sequence?
Okay, thank you, and congratulate your undergraduates.
I will. Thank you.
So is there any other question? Can you? No? So please.
Sorry, can I ask one last question?
Yes, sure.
So I'm in the beginning, you showed that there was this sort of like contradictory results where one study found that there were a lot of AGN, more than half, and the other one didn't. And now I can't recall what techniques they used, but so what's the solution?
So, okay, so X-rays found, yes, they were present, and infrared said not so much. So my results are consistent with the X-rays. Infrared, I wondered to what degree it might be a contamination aspect as well, where they're not so particularly luminous. So it might be an issue that disentangling how much of that infrared is from AGN and how much of it is from star formation. And also the AGN selection criteria using WISE colors are usually set more for cleanliness than for like reducing the amount of contamination and being really sure that what you're selecting is an AGN, as opposed to making sure that you're getting all of the AGN, even if you're accidentally selecting some star forming galaxies as well. So I think it might be a mix of those two.
Thanks.
Yeah.
So, is there another question? So please, let's thank again our two speakers. Thank you so much for being here with us. I hope someday we can go back to our normal seminars and be able to invite you again. Thank you so much. And this is all for today. If you want to talk to them, please, you still have time to list yourself on their one-on-one meetings. So please join them.
So Lorraine, are you still there?
Yes.
So you said you didn't have time to talk about the one galaxy. It was 1266.
Yes.
It had an extended X-ray coincident with the radio.
Yeah.
Now maybe there's a few minutes. If you have 3 or 4 minutes, and the chair will let you talk a few more minutes. Could you, if there's something you particularly want to say about it that you would say?
Let's see. Well, so it's what I hadn't prepared anything on this, I will be quite honest, but what we found is that there's temperature structure within that gas. Let me see if I can